We did want to talk about this story, which is not a funny story, but it's an interesting story. And that is that a aide who worked for both Governor Hochul and Governor Cuomo has been accused of being of working, I don't know, for China directly. And I love this. This is the headline from the New York Times. Will's making fun of it, but I just thought it was interesting. New York official charged with taking money, travel, and poultry to aid China. And the first couple paragraphs is all about the amount of duck that was provided by the Chinese consulate to be prepared duck. Now, again, that sounds like small claims, but that's just the small part of this. What really is that China, once again, it's been proven, it seems like, infiltrating high-level officials, especially in New York. And you remember what Governor Hochul called you. She called you a clown. But look what's happening in her own government.
Rick, why does it seem that the Chinese spies have such an easy time embedding themselves within the apparatus of Democrat politicians?
Well, let me just add one thing. I got to be careful here as the former acting director of national intelligence. I know a lot about this story, and I might know a little bit too much. There's more to come on this. We have had a very serious problem with the Chinese dealing with local and state politicians. Sometimes those local and state politicians did not understand that they were dealing with, talking to, and negotiating with Chinese communist officials. And sometimes those state and local officials knew that they were dealing with communist officials. The intelligence community understands this. It's been a growing problem. I do know that there are reporters looking into this as we speak. And let's just say that, in the Trump administration, we were clear-eyed about what was happening. If you remember, we shut down a consulate of the Chinese over this issue because they had infiltrated too much. I was a big advocate for being much stronger with our consulate in San Francisco. The Chinese consulate in San Francisco has historically been a problem, and I think we needed to be much tougher with the Chinese on what they're doing. We know that we've got the Confucius centers all throughout America at our universities, and our university endowments and the funding that they get for research departments and chairmanships has been a real problem with how the Chinese have started funding some of those entities and programs. And so we've got to be much more vigilant about what the Chinese are doing. And I'll finish with this, is that, it's clear to me that as America has been distracted by, Joe Biden's mental acuities and the replacement of Joe with Kamala and a war in Europe and multiple wars in the Middle East, the Chinese are very happy that America is distracted. And that's what they want, and that's how they operate. When we're distracted, they come in.
Rick, I actually want to pivot a little bit from this topic. We'll get back to this topic. But we had a call come in earlier that said, what do you think would have happened with President Trump? I know he says October 7th would never have happened, but what do you think would have happened? What if something like this was to occur? And of course, as you said, and again, this is not being just a Trump apologist and saying this, we know where things were headed in the Middle East. And again, we need to remind everyone, 4 years ago, we were not talking about these kind of topics. We may have been talking about what's going on in China because we were shutting it down when it was happening. We may have been talking about the Middle East because there was maybe what would be considered a peace in the Middle East for the first time in my lifetime. But how quickly we all forget.
Look, it's something that we need to constantly talk about, because I do think that there are a bunch of independent voters who are not focused on this race. And once we get closer to the election, when people realize that Donald Trump brought peace between Arabs and Israelis, some of the most difficult peace negotiations and outcomes that we've seen. When Donald Trump brought peace between Arabs and Israelis and dried up the funding from Iran to terrorists, that created peace like never before. We now have a situation where the Iranians are well funded because of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And the reality is that that's how the October 7th war was launched, is through the funding that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris gave to Iran. Everybody knows this. The entire Middle East knows this. And so we need independent voters to understand that these terrible policies have consequences, and the consequences are war.
Rick, and I wanted to bring back up, you mentioned a consulate that was closed during the Trump administration, and that was the Houston consulate for the Chinese Communist Party, for the government of China. But you mentioned that San Francisco is another problem area. You've mentioned that on this broadcast for years now, that these consulates are an issue, and that's the connection point that this government official in New York, the deputy chief of staff to the governor of New York, that was her tie point to the CCP, was through the New York consulate. And I think what we were concerned about with the beginning of the Biden administration was this complacency, this globalist view, this appeasement that we saw with our adversaries. We now know that Tim Walz is on record saying we don't need to see China as an adversary, even though that's not really our choice, because it's the Chinese Communist Party who's decided who the adversary is. But as you look at this, the growing issue, whether it be academics that are on the payroll of China, whether it be the Confucius Institutes that you mentioned, that don't just affect higher education, but even our elementary and middle and high schools that are public schools in the United States, how deep-rooted is this issue, and how much more has it been able to grow over these last 3.5 years?
It's such a good question, Will, and I think it's pretty deep-seated. And the reason why it's deep-seated is because we have been distracted. We have not allowed our political system to really focus on what China is doing. And that needs to change. Many of the reasons why we don't focus on what China is doing is because we're distracted through wars. And that's the one thing that, if everybody remembers, Donald Trump was focused on China. He took on China, talked about the tariff problems that we were having. He was penalizing them. I can tell you, as U.S. ambassador to Germany, I was working on Europeans to support Donald Trump's squeezing of China. This can happen when we have fewer wars, when we don't have the crises of the Middle East and Europe. This is the benefit. We can work on other issues. And I'll add the Western Hemisphere. When you look at what the State Department has done in Central and South America, it's scary. They have supported very far left, this current State Department, the Blinken State Department. They've supported far left regimes and are spending money, U.S. taxpayer money, to support these far left regimes. We've got to be able to solve some of these problems so that we can work on Asia, so we can work on Africa, so we can work on the Western Hemisphere. We cannot have a war in Europe and a constant war in the Middle East while China loves the fact that we're distracted.
Rick, thanks so much for joining us each and every week. We appreciate it.